40,000 farmers just shot at 11,000 warships, and the warships blinked first. The Unity Assembly Chamber existed to make visitors feel small. Everyone inside had understood that this was the entire point of the architecture. The ceiling climbed 400 meters above the floor, and it was carved from a single slab of black Valresh stone, hauled across 6 star systems at a cost that could have fed 3 colonies for a decade instead. The seating rose in perfect tiers around a circular floor. Each species held a position based on how long they had belonged to the assembly. The oldest members sat highest, the newest sat at the bottom and looked up. Nobody pretended that placement was an accident. Ambassador Corvin of the Thren arrived early because early arrival was simply his habit. He was old even by the standards of his own long-lived people. The gray had moved past his temples years ago and claimed the rest of him. His joints complained every single morning now, and he had stopped arguing with them. He carried one data chip in his left hand. He had not slept the night before. He took his seat in the middle tier where the Thren delegation had sat for 300 years. Not old enough for the top rows, not young enough for the bottom. The middle was where a species could see everything happening and change almost none of it. Other delegates filed in across the following hour. The Ostran came last, as they always did. Overseer Malric led their delegation of 7 with robes the color of deep water and a walk that suggested ownership of the entire floor, because in most practical ways that ownership was real. The Ostran hegemony had held a controlling majority in the assembly for 60 years. They had expanded their territory 11 separate times across that span. By every measurable standard, they were the dominant power in known space. Malric did not glance at Corvin as he passed. He never did. Speaker Yelna called the session to order. She was a thin Corvin woman who had run this chamber for 22 years and wore the permanent expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything at all. She called the first item on the docket, Territory Review, Corridor 9 Halcyon. Corvin straightened in his seat. Corridor 9 Halcyon was a narrow spiral arm passage that sat between 2 major trade lanes. It held little in the way of resources and fewer people than most colonized systems. 3 years earlier, a small species known as humanity had planted their 4th colony there. Meridian Hollow held 40,000 residents, miners mostly, some farmers, 1 medical station. Now the Ostran wanted the corridor for themselves. The debate opened the way these debates always opened, with maps. An Ostran delegate stood and walked the chamber through the strategic value of the corridor using phrases like natural extension and historical claim and underutilized space. He had a pleasant voice and he smiled often. His maps showed the corridor as nearly empty, which it was not. The colony markers on his display were tiny, and the Ostran territory markers were enormous and painted a confident shade of blue. Several other delegates spoke after him. Most said things like, "We understand the strategic concern, and of course this must be handled diplomatically, and we trust the Assembly's judgment." None of them said no. Corvin listened to all of it in silence. When the speaker called for final remarks before the vote, which was the usual empty formality, nobody expected anyone to rise. Corvin rose. A small ripple passed through the chamber, not shock, just notice. The old Thren ambassador had not given a floor speech in 4 sessions. "Ambassador Corvin, you have the floor," said the speaker. He carried no notes. He had spent 3 weeks composing what he wanted to say, and he knew every word of it by heart. "I want to talk about humanity," he said. His voice carried well through the acoustics he had learned to use across decades in this room. "I visited their homeworld 11 years ago," he said. "I served on the first formal Thren diplomatic contact mission. I spent 4 months on the surface. I read their history, I spoke with their leaders, I ate their food, which I will admit was considerably better than I expected." He paused. Nobody laughed. "I want to share what I learned there." Malric watched from the upper tiers with an expression that was not quite boredom and not quite irritation. Something suspended between the two. "Humanity has been a spacefaring people for 61 years, Corvin said. In that span they have founded 7 colonies and developed 2 entirely new propulsion systems and made first contact with 14 other species. By those numbers they look young and small and easily managed." He let the words hang there. They are not. He touched the data chip in his hand but did not use it. He did not need it. "This species spent 10,000 years locked in continuous conflict with itself," he said. "Not see occasional border skirmishes. Continuous total civilizational warfare with pauses but never a lasting peace. They fought over land and water and belief, and the color of one another's skin and words printed in books and lines drawn on maps that kept shifting. They built weapons designed specifically to erase everything within a given radius and then improved those weapons 17 separate times. They engineered diseases as instruments of war. They burned each other's cities to ash and then buried each other in unmarked ground and built new cities directly on top of the graves and named the streets after the people who had done the burying. The chamber had gone quiet. This was not the usual shape of an assembly speech. They did all of that, Corvin continued, and they survived it, not merely survived. They kept building. They kept raising children. They kept composing music and painting on walls and arguing about philosophy in the same breath they used to sharpen their knives. And then 61 years ago they looked up at the stars and decided to go there. He looked directly at Malric. 61 years into spaceflight, he said, and already better at it than species usually manage after 2 centuries. Because they spent 10,000 years learning how to fight and how to endure and how to turn catastrophic loss into a reason to try harder. That is not praise offered on their behalf. That is simply what their own history shows. He paused once more. If this assembly authorizes a strike against a human colony, he said, it will not be the opening move of a campaign. It will be the opening move of a war. A war this assembly is not prepared for because everyone here is looking at their fleet counts and their colony numbers and their years in space, and those numbers look small. I am telling you, those numbers are the wrong thing to measure. He sat down. The chamber held its silence for one long moment. Then Malric spoke from the upper tier without rising, which was his particular way of signaling that the matter was not worth the effort of standing. The Thren ambassador has given us a very colorful history lesson, Malric said, as a small ripple of laughter moved through the upper rows, and I am certain the humans are quite impressive in their own modest way. But I believe the ambassador may be confusing what a species once was with what it currently is. Humanity has held space travel for 61 years. We have held it for 900. They possess 7 colonies. We possess 83. They field 1 combat fleet of 42 vessels. We field a standing force of 11,000 ships. He let the number sit in the air. I respect the ambassador's caution, Malric said in a tone that made plain he did not. But I would remind this assembly that every species looks more dangerous than it is the first time it is encountered. This is natural. We are cautious creatures, and caution has kept us alive this long. He paused. Caution is a virtue. Paralysis is not. Another ripple of laughter moved through the room, louder this time. Corvin did not answer. He looked at his own hands. 3 more delegates spoke after that, and 2 of them cited Malric's fleet numbers directly, and one noted that the Meridian Hollow colony had never been formally registered with the Assembly's Territorial Bureau, which was technically true and entirely beside the point. The session drifted toward its conclusion the way these sessions always drifted, like water finding the lowest ground, inevitable and driven by nothing but weight. The vote was called. Corvin voted no. The Thren delegation cast 4 votes against 47 in favor. The motion carried. The Austrian fleet was authorized to move into Corridor 9 Halcyon and secure the corridor and invite the Meridian Hollow colony to negotiate terms of integration into Austrian-administered space. The word invite sat in the official record. 11,000 ships was what that invitation looked like in practice. Malric accepted the vote with a small, satisfied nod. He spoke briefly to the delegates beside him. He smiled the smile of a man who had just received something he already believed belonged to him. Corvin collected his data chip and stood. He looked at no one. He left the chamber through the side door reserved for lesser delegations. The corridor outside stretched long and cold under blue-white lighting that made every visitor look faintly ill. His footsteps echoed. Nobody else had come out yet. The session would run another hour on matters of trade and infrastructure and votes, the ordinary business of running a galaxy. He stopped at the window at the corridor's end. The view from the assembly station was extraordinary. 3 separate nebulae were visible from this angle, soft-looking clouds of color that were in truth hundreds of light-years wide. Between them, barely visible, ran the faint smear of the Halcyon Passage where the corridor sat and where Meridian Hollow sat and where 40,000 people were living their ordinary lives with no idea a vote had just been cast about their future. Corvin stood at that window a long while. He thought about the human homeworld. He thought about the 4 months he had spent walking its surface. He thought about a museum he had visited in a city called Johannesburg, a museum devoted to conflict that had ended before humanity ever reached space. A dark and careful exhibit about what people had done to one another and why and what it had cost and what had been rebuilt afterward. He thought about the woman who had curated that museum. Her name was Dr. Wren. She was 70 years old, and she had walked him through every room with the calm, level manner of someone who believed remembering a terrible thing was the only honest tribute you could pay it. He remembered what she had told him at the end of the tour when he asked how humanity had moved past it. "We did not move past it," she had said. "You carry it. The trick is not letting it crush you while still letting it matter." He thought about that now. He thought about the vote. He thought about Malric's smile. He pressed his palm against the cold glass and looked at the stars and thought about what was coming. He did not feel righteous for having spoken. Righteousness was a young feeling, and he was very old. What he felt instead was the particular grief of a person who has said the correct thing at the correct moment and been heard by absolutely no one. His aide found him there 20 minutes later, a young Thren woman named Isolde, sharp and careful and loyal. She had worked for him 6 years and knew better than to speak first. The vote passed, Corvin said, without turning from the window. "Yes," Isolde said, "the fleet moves in 48 hours. Standard Austrian mobilization runs 36 hours," she added carefully, "if they choose to prioritize it." He was quiet a moment. "Send word to our consulate on the human homeworld, standard diplomatic courtesy, inform them of the Assembly's decision. Tell them the Thren delegation voted against." "Do you want to send anything beyond that?" He considered it. He tried to think of a single sentence that would actually help. He could not find one. The humans would learn of this through their own channels soon enough. Every species watched the Assembly closely, even the ones who pretended otherwise. "No," he said, "just the vote record." Isolde noted it, "and your schedule for the next session." "Clear it." She paused. "All of it. All of it." He finally turned from the window. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I do not think the coming sessions will resemble anything we planned for." Isolde studied him. She had the look of someone holding back a question because she had already calculated that the answer would not comfort her. She kept it to herself. "Yes, Ambassador," she said. Corvin looked back at the window one final time. At the nebulae, at the corridor between them, at the small invisible point where Meridian Hollow sat and where 40,000 people were waking or sleeping or eating or arguing over ordinary things at that very moment. He had done what he could do. He had stood in a room full of powerful beings and told them the truth, which was the only thing an ambassador could offer once the room had already made up its mind. He was not naive enough to believe the truth would change anything. The vote had been decided before the session even opened, as most assembly votes were, but the record would show he had said it. The record would show the Thren had voted against. That mattered in some small, long-term historical way. It would not matter at all to Meridian Hollow. He pocketed his data chip and walked back down the corridor toward the station's exit with his footsteps echoing in the cold blue-white light. He had said what needed saying. Whatever came next was no longer his sin to carry. The Austrian fleet reached Meridian Hollow on a Tuesday. The colonists would remember that detail later in the strange way survivors always remember irrelevant specifics. The day of the week, the weather, what they had eaten for breakfast, clear skies over the northern settlement that morning. A shipment of ore processing equipment had just arrived from the human homeworld and still sat crated in the landing yard. The fleet dropped out of transit in a wide formation, which was standard Austrian doctrine. Spread out, present maximum silhouette. Let the target understand the scale of what faced them before a single weapon fired. 1,100 ships made up the advance element. The remaining 10,000 waited back in Austrian space, ready to follow. This was only the opening hand, and it already outmatched anything Meridian Hollow's 3 aging defense platforms could answer. Commander Havoc stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Dominion's Edge, and watched the colony resolve on the forward display. A small settlement of roughly 40,000 people. A secondary mining outpost 200 kilometers north, 3 orbital platforms old by Austrian standards. The kind of hardware a young colony built when both budget and time ran short. He had reviewed the intelligence files on Meridian Hollow twice during transit. He knew the layout and the population count and the resource output and the names of the 3 elected administrators. He knew the defense platforms carried kinetic rail systems and short-range plasma batteries, adequate for meteor deflection and piracy deterrence, and almost nothing beyond that. "This should be quick," he told his weapons officer. "Hail them." The communications officer opened the channel and delivered the speech he had rehearsed. The formal demand for negotiation, the offer of integration into Austrian-administered space, a 30-minute window for response. He delivered it cleanly and professionally. He was not a cruel man. He genuinely believed the colonists would look at 1,100 ships and make the sensible choice. The channel stayed open roughly 40 seconds. Then one of the defense platforms fired, a single kinetic round using old propellant. The kind of weapon Austrian engineers had stopped worrying about 2 generations earlier. It struck the shields of a light patrol vessel near the formation's edge and accomplished nothing structural. But it was a shot fired at 1,100 ships from a colony of 40,000 people. Havix blinked. He looked at his weapons officer. His weapons officer looked back at him. "Sir, the communications officer said the colony is broadcasting." The face that appeared on screen belonged to none of the 3 elected administrators. It belonged to a woman in a miner's work suit, gray-haired and perhaps 65, standing inside what looked like a community assembly hall. Behind her, through a wide window, people moved with clear purpose, not panic, purpose. Havix noted the difference without quite understanding why it unsettled him. "This is Meridian Hollow," the woman said. Her voice stayed level. "We received your message. We are not interested in integration. We are formally informing you that you have entered human-claimed space without authorization, and we are requesting your immediate withdrawal." She paused. "We have already transmitted this exchange to Earth Command. Whatever happens here is now on your record." The channel closed. Havix sat with that for a moment, then he gave the order. The first volley from 1,100 ships struck Meridian Hollow's orbital platforms in under 4 minutes. The platforms had been built well. They absorbed more than the intelligence files predicted, but the outcome was never in question. The first platform broke apart at the 6-minute mark. The second went dark 8 minutes after that. The third managed 3 more shots before the end, none of which caused measurable damage, all of which were aimed with what Havix could only describe as deliberate precision. Even at the very end, they were still aiming. He filed that fact away somewhere in his mind. The ground assault was supposed to follow the standard doctrine: destroy orbital capability, demand ground surrender, land peacekeeping forces to administer the transition. Clean and predictable. What happened instead was not clean at all. The first Austrian landing craft touched down at the settlement's edge before its ramp had even fully lowered, and someone fired at it from a water tower 300 meters away. The shot came from a hunting rifle and bounced harmlessly off the hull. The second craft set down near the ore processing yard and was struck by a fully loaded ore hauler driven directly into it at top speed by someone who leapt clear in the final seconds. The hauler weighed roughly 800 tons. The landing struts held, but the impact crumpled the forward-loading ramp, and the craft could not deploy its troops. The third craft never touched down at all. Someone on the ground had rerouted power from the settlement's main reactor into the emergency magnetic accelerator, normally used to launch ore canisters into orbit, and had fired a rapid series of 800-kilogram canisters at the descending craft. These were not precision weapons, but there were many of them, and the third craft veered off with heavy damage to its port engine. Havix stood at his display and watched his tidy operation unravel. "What are they shooting with?" he asked. His intelligence officer looked genuinely baffled. "Mining equipment, sir. Industrial machinery. We are seeing—" He paused and looked again. "We are seeing converted supply freighters moving to intercept our secondary patrol wing. Supply freighters. They have mounted ore accelerators externally. Jury-rigged. They should not be able to fire at that angle, but they are." A pause. "One of our patrol vessels has taken a hit." Havix studied the display. 40,000 farmers and miners and teachers and doctors with no military training and no military hardware and 30 minutes of warning had just damaged an Austrian patrol vessel using a repurposed ore launcher bolted to the outside of a cargo freighter. Something cold moved through him then. He could not name it precisely. Not fear yet. Closer to the feeling of stepping onto ground you believed was solid and feeling it shift slightly underfoot. "Deploy the ground troops," he said. "Full force, end this quickly." Elena Marsh was 67 years old and had lived on Meridian Hollow for 11 years. She had come out from a city called Halden on the human homeworld after her husband died and her children had grown, and she found she did not want to spend her remaining decades somewhere everything reminded her of the years before. Meridian Hollow was not comfortable. The soil was wrong for most of what she wanted to grow. The winters ran long and the light carried a different color than the light back home, slightly more orange. It had taken her 3 years to stop finding it strange. She loved it there anyway. She was surprised by how much she loved it. When the ships appeared that Tuesday morning, she sat in the community hall because the emergency broadcast had pulled everyone in and Administrator Reyes was doing a reasonable job keeping people calm considering the circumstances. Alina sat in the back row and listened to the broadcast from the Austrian fleet, the formal voice, the careful words. She watched the faces around her. She was not afraid, and she noted this with a kind of curiosity. She thought she should be afraid, and she was not. She felt angry instead in a way that ran quiet and deep, like a stone, resting at the bottom of cold water. When Administrator Reyes finished her response, the one Havix had watched on his own display, she turned to the room and said they had perhaps 20 minutes before things turned serious and asked what everyone was prepared to do. The room answered. Alina was not young enough for the defense platforms and not trained enough for the freighters. What she could do was move the children into the mine shafts, which ran deep enough into the rock that orbital bombardment could not reach them. So that was what she did. She moved through the settlement for 40 minutes while the sky overhead lit up with things she could not name, gathering children and the parents who were not fighting and moving all of them into the earth. She got 63 people into Shaft 7 before the ground forces arrived. The shaft entrance was a heavy industrial door sealed from the inside. She pulled it shut behind her and locked it and sat with her back against the cold metal listening to the sounds coming through the rock. She could not see anything. She could only feel the vibration when something heavy fell nearby and hear the muffled sounds of things happening above. At some point, a small boy of maybe 4 or 5 named Milo climbed into her lap and fell asleep. She sat there with Milo asleep on her lap and listened to the world above her change. She had plenty of time to think. She thought about what she had watched on the broadcast before she went to gather the children. The formation on the sky feed, all those ships. She thought about what her father had told her once when she was young and frightened by something she could no longer name. He had said the size of the thing coming at you is not what decides what happens next. What decides it is what you do in the next 5 minutes. Her father had been a very practical man. She thought about the ore hauler someone had driven at a landing craft before jumping clear. She did not know who had done that. She hoped they had jumped in time. It took the Austrian ground forces 4 hours to secure the main settlement. Not 30 minutes, not 1 hour. 4 hours against people armed with hunting rifles and industrial machinery and a colony's worth of accumulated stubbornness. Havix received the final control report and read it 3 times because the casualty figures did not look right and he wanted to be certain he had them correctly. 17 Austrian soldiers dead, 89 wounded, 1 patrol vessel with significant damage, 2 landing craft disabled, all against 40,000 colonists with no military of their own. He sat with the number 17 and considered what it meant. 17 was not a catastrophic figure in historical terms. It was a small number, but context mattered, and the context here was that it had come from people who were not soldiers fighting with tools, and it had come in 4 hours. He thought about what that number would look like if those people had been actual soldiers. He thought about what it would look like given 4 days instead of 4 hours. He set the report down and asked his communications officer for the latest intercepts from the direction of the human homeworld. The officer pulled them up. Havix read them. The human military command had received the alert from Meridian Hollow within minutes of the attack. The colony had transmitted everything. The Austrian broadcast. The exchange with Administrator Reyes. The live feed of the orbital platforms breaking apart. The signal had reached Earth Command 8 hours earlier. Their response had been broadcasting for 6. The content was short. 1 message sent across every channel and already picked up by 17 other species monitoring stations, which meant it was never meant to stay private. It was meant to be heard. Havix read it to the assembly and every monitoring party listening. At 0840 hours Tuesday, the 14th Austrian military forces attacked and occupied the human colony of Meridian Hollow without provocation and without legal authority. Earth Command is treating this as an act of war. All human vessels, stations, and colonies are hereby placed on full military footing. Further communication will be conducted through Admiral Talia Voss Earth Combined Fleet Command. He read it twice. He noted the name Admiral Talia Voss. He did not recognize it. He kept intelligence files on the human military leadership and he searched his memory and found nothing, which meant she was either new to the position or had been deliberately kept out of public record. Neither possibility comforted him. He also noted the phrase full military footing. He had studied enough human history to know that phrase never referred to anything small, even if most of his colleagues had never bothered to read the history carefully enough to understand it. He sent word to Overseer Malric flagging the intercept. Malric's reply arrived 2 hours later. Proceed with integration. Earth is posturing. Monitor and report. Havex read that reply. He saved the intercept. He saved Malric's response. He saved his own message. He did not fully understand why he was keeping them. He told himself it was standard record keeping. He looked back at the display. On the surface, his forces held the main settlement. The secondary mining outpost was still holding out with a handful of people and no military hardware left to fight with. His ground commander requested authorization to move against the outpost. He authorized it, then he pulled up the scan of the mine shafts, 17 of them running deep into the rock. His ground commander had flagged them. People had gone inside. The doors were sealed from within. Austrian standard doctrine in occupied territory called for waiting them out. People always came up eventually. Havex approved the wait. He did not order the shafts forced open. He was not entirely sure later why he made that choice. He told himself it was practical since forcing a sealed mine shaft was costly and slow. But there was something else underneath it that he chose not to examine too closely. Something about the image of people carrying their children into the ground and sealing the door behind them and sitting in the dark. Something that felt, if he was honest, like a kind of courage he had not expected to find among farmers. He studied the display a long time. Outside the shaft doors, 63 people sat in the dark and waited. Elena Marsh sat with a sleeping child on her lap and memorized the sounds of the ships above, and memorized the feel of the rock walls around her, and memorized every detail of that moment because she had lived long enough to know that the things worth remembering were the things you forced yourself to remember before the weight of later settled down on top of them. She memorized their ships. She memorized their markings. There was nothing left to do but remember. 8 months after Meridian Hollow, Overseer Malric called a briefing. It was meant to be routine, a review of the campaign's progress. The kind of meeting that 4 months earlier and 6 months earlier had delivered mostly good news in orderly fashion. Territory secured, human vessels pushed back, the corridor locked down. Those meetings had been easy. This one was not. Malric sat at the head of the long table in the Dominion's Edge command room and studied the faces of his senior officers and understood somewhere in the back of his mind that he was not ready to hear what was coming. The faces had changed. Something behind their eyes had shifted since 8 months ago. He had seen that particular look before. He had simply never expected to see it worn by his own officers. Commander Havex placed the report on the table in front of him. Malric looked at the cover without opening it yet. "Give it to me directly," he said. Havex had held this job for 22 years and was not a man who flinched. He did not flinch now, but he took a breath before speaking, which was not his habit, and Malric noticed it. Fleet losses as of this morning, Havex said. 41% of the advance force, 17% of the second wave, 3 of our 8 resupply stations destroyed. The Meridian corridor remains contested. We hold the colony but not the surrounding space. He paused. The humans have established a forward command position somewhere in the Kestrel belt. We cannot confirm its exact location. We have tried 4 times. Malric looked at him. 4 times. Each time we sent a search and clear group, it did not return. A pause. The 4th group numbered 40 ships. The room went quiet. Malric opened the report and studied the figures. He was a man genuinely skilled at reading numbers. It was one of his real talents and part of why he had risen to overseer in the first place. He read the casualty figures. He read the loss rates. He read the projections. He closed the report. "These projections," he said. "If they are accurate," Havex said, "they are the conservative estimate." Malric looked at him. "I asked the modeling team to run 3 versions: optimistic, realistic, conservative. What you are looking at is the conservative one." Havex stopped. "The other 2 are worse." Malric set the report down and stared at the table a long while, long enough that the officers around it began exchanging careful glances that never moved their heads. How Malric finally said, not angrily. He sounded like a man genuinely trying to understand something. "Explain to me how a species with 42 ships 8 months ago is doing this to 11,000. Havex had spent a great deal of time thinking about that exact question. Late at night, going through the engagement records one by one. "They do not fight the way we expected," he said. "They do not fight the way any species fights. Every engagement model we own is built on observed behavior from species with established military doctrine. You learn the doctrine and you know what to expect and you can plan around it." He set his hands flat on the table. "Humans do not carry 200 years of doctrine. They carry 60. so instead of doctrine they carry adaptation. Every time we build a counter to something they have done, they have already stopped doing it. They never repeat a failed tactic, not even once. All species adapt, Maurik said. Not like this. Havix pulled up a display. The first battle of Kestrel reached 3 months in. They used a pincer formation, standard aggressive pattern. We countered with a containment spread and it worked. They lost 30 ships. He moved to the next engagement. The second battle of Kestrel reached 3 weeks later. No pincer at all. They came from below the engagement plane where we had no sensors oriented because nobody orients sensors that way. It is not a standard attack vector. We lost 60 ships before we could reorient. He moved again. The outer Halcyon engagement 5 months in. They faked a full retreat and let us pursue and then used the asteroid field to split our pursuing force into 3 groups engaged separately. We lost 112 ships. He looked at Malric. We have not seen the same human tactic repeated once in 8 months. They are inventing it as they go and it keeps working. Malric studied the display. His expression had drifted away from its usual comfortable certainty into something Havix could not quite name. And their numbers, Malric said, how are they replacing losses? They started with 42. Earth has been manufacturing around the clock, Havix said. They converted civilian shipyards entirely. Cargo freighter production has stopped completely. They are building military vessels only now. He paused. We have received intelligence that 12 other species have sent ships in support to Earth Command. Species that were, he chose the next word carefully, previously unhappy with Austrian territorial policy. Malric went very still. How many ships total, including Earth's own production? Our best estimate is 460 vessels currently in the human combined fleet. Havix looked at him steadily. 8 months ago they had 42. Ambassador Corvin received the battle reports the same way everyone outside the conflict did. Through the Assembly's monitoring network, which was meant to be neutral, but which every delegation used to try to understand who was winning and what it meant for them. He read them alone in his office on the Assembly station with a cup of cold tea he had forgotten to drink. He did not feel satisfied. He had once imagined in the abstract that he might feel something like vindication. The grim, quiet feeling of having been proven right, he did not feel that. What he felt instead was closer to what he had felt at that window 8 months earlier, a kind of heavy quiet. Another Thren diplomat, a younger man named Renlo attached to the trade division, came to his office that afternoon. He knocked and Corvin told him to enter, and Renlo sat down with the careful manner of someone holding a question he was not sure he should ask. The battle reports, Renlo said. Yes, Corvin said. The humans are, it looks like, there. Yes. Renlo was quiet a moment. You do not look surprised. I am not. You do not look pleased either. Corvin looked at his cold tea. The Austrian hold 83 colonies, he said. Many have been under their control for a long time. Many hold Austrian citizens who had not. Hing whatsoever to do with the decision to strike Meridian Hollow. He picked up the cup and set it back down. There are no clean wars. There are only wars. Renlo sat with that. Do you think it will stop before it goes too far? Corvin looked at him. Renlo was perhaps 30 years old, bright and genuinely decent. He had not been in the chamber the day of the vote. He had not seen Malric smile. I think Corvin said carefully that the overseer is a man who has never once been wrong about something this large. And I think a man like that has tremendous difficulty accepting information that tells him otherwise. He paused. So no, I do not think it stops because Malric chooses to stop it. Then how does it stop? Corvin thought about that for a moment. He thought about Havix. He had read the name in the reports, the commander who had flagged the Meridian Hollow mine shafts and chosen not to force them open. He did not know whether Havix was the kind of man capable of doing what needed doing. He hoped he was. Someone on their side will have to do it, he said. The Battle of the Vanter supply chain took place in month 7, and by any military accounting it was the moment the war changed shape entirely. The Austrian maintained 8 major resupply stations spread across their military corridor. Fuel, ammunition, repair materials, medical supplies. This chain fed the entire advance fleet. Without it, sustained forward operations became impossible within roughly 6 weeks. Admiral Talia Voss had been studying that supply chain for 3 months. She was not a loud person. The officers who worked under her described her, on the rare occasions they described her at all, as quiet and thorough. She thought in long arcs. She played every scenario from its ending backward to its opening, which was not the usual way people planned, but it was her way. She had grown up in a place called Logos and studied engineering before joining Earth's fledgling space fleet at 24 because someone needed to. She turned out to be extraordinarily good at logistics, which was the single most important skill in any military campaign and also the thing most commanders found dull. She did not find it dull. Logistics was the skeleton beneath every plan, the part nobody saw but everything else hung from it. She had a plan now. It was not dramatic, and that was intentional because dramatic plans carried single points of failure. Her plan had none. It was 7 small actions that together produced one result, and each looked in isolation like an entirely different kind of operation. A probe here, a false retreat there, 2 small engagements near Outpost 6 that appeared to be attempts at capturing the station and were not. What they actually accomplished was movement. Getting ships into position without the Ostren ever understanding what position they were moving into. The night before she executed the plan, she sat in her quarters aboard the command carrier the Meridian and studied the operational map for a long time. She drank real coffee grown by her mother on a small farm and shipped to her 3 months earlier in a care package she was rationing carefully because more would not arrive for a while. The coffee was excellent. It had arrived with a note that read, "Come home safe. The garden misses you." Voss studied the map. She thought about Meridian Hollow. She thought about the colony's final transmission before the platforms went dark. She had watched it many times, the gray-haired woman in the community hall, the people moving purposefully behind her. She had learned afterward that the woman's name was Alina Marsh and that she had survived inside a mine shaft and had brought out 63 people, including 29 children. She thought about that, she drank her coffee. In the morning, she gave the order. The 7 actions began simultaneously across 400 kilometers of contested space. The Ostran response moved toward the most visible action, the largest human force heading directly toward Outpost 6 exactly as she had expected. They pulled ships from their secondary screening positions. They tightened the formation around the station, which opened the corridor behind them. 80 human ships came through that opening in 2 minutes, not toward the stations. Past them, toward the automated relay network connecting all 8 stations to one another and to Ostran Prime. The relay network carried little defense of its own since it was infrastructure and not a target, and the Ostran had never considered it something worth defending. Voss had considered it for 3 months. The relay network went dark in 4 minutes. Without it, the 8 stations could not coordinate. Without coordination, the resupply chain became 8 separate stations instead of one system. 6 of the 8 were destroyed or disabled within the following 2 hours. The remaining 2 were cut off entirely. Havex received the report on the bridge of the Dominion's edge. And read it standing up, he read it twice. Then he turned to the display and pulled up the full strategic map, all of Ostran military space, the colony corridor, the contested zones, the engagement lines. He looked at all of it together for the first time in several weeks because studying it piece by piece had been easier. The pieces alone still felt manageable, but taken together the picture told a different story. He looked at how many indicator lights had changed color across the past 8 months. Red for lost, yellow for contested. Red and yellow had spread across the map in a way that became obvious the moment you stepped back far enough to see the whole of it. A great many lights had been Ostran blue 8 months ago. He thought about what he would say to Malric. He thought about the fleet numbers and the supply chain and the rate of change across the engagement patterns. He thought about the modeling team's 3 projections and where they now stood against all of them. They were not on the optimistic line. They were not on the realistic line either. Havex looked at the star map a long while. He looked at how many lights had gone dark. He reached a decision he had been approaching for weeks, the way a person approaches an edge they know is there without quite letting themselves arrive at it. He arrived at it now. He called his communications officer. "I need a private channel," he said. "Encrypted. Route it through the Corvin civilian network. I do not want it anywhere near our military systems." The officer looked at him. "Sir." "Do what Havex said." The officer did it. Havex sat down and considered what to say and how to say it. He thought about Meridian Hollow and the mine shaft doors sealed from within, and the woman in the community hall who had told them to leave human space, and the number 17 which had not stopped sitting at the back of his mind for 8 months. He thought about the star map and the dark lights. He thought about how many more lights would go dark before Malric was willing to look at the whole map at once. He began writing. He wrote to Admiral Talia Voss of Earth Combined Fleet Command. He did not know whether she would respond. He did not know whether he was too late or not late enough or exactly the right amount of late for the conversation he needed to have. He did not know if she was the kind of person who could even be reasoned with. He knew he had to try. He sent the message. Then he looked at the star map a long while. Voss read Havix's message 3 separate times. The first pass fast, the way she read everything fast, scanning for shape and intent in whatever sat beneath the words. The second pass slow, hunting for a trap. The third pass careful, the way her engineering training had taught her to read specifications, looking for what was stated and what was implied and what had been left out entirely. What was stated, Commander Havix, senior officer of the Austrian advance fleet, requested a private meeting. No weapons, 1 ship each, neutral coordinates which he proposed and which she could reject and replace with her own. What was implied, he was doing this without authorization. The routing she traced, which her signals team had spent 4 hours confirming, ran entirely through the Corvin civilian network. He had deliberately kept it off Austrian military channels. What was absent, any mention of Overseer Malric. She sat with the message for a full day, not because she was undecided since she knew within the first hour what she intended to do, but because the decision carried real weight and she believed in giving weight its proper time. It was a habit of hers. Her officers found it faintly unnerving, the way she went quiet before a major decision. They had learned to leave her alone when she went quiet. She replaced his proposed coordinates with her own. A stretch of empty space in the outer kestrel region far from both fleets where the nearest star was a dim red dwarf giving off just enough light to navigate by and nothing more. She sent the response through the same Corvin routing he had used. He confirmed within 2 hours. She took 1 ship, a small, fast courier called the Solace, with a crew of 12. She left her second-in-command behind with sealed orders and departed alone. The Solace and Havix's ship, a light scout vessel as promised and smaller than her own courier, arrived at the coordinates within 20 minutes of each other. No weapons were charged on either side. Her sensors confirmed it, and she had people watching his ship every second of the approach and would keep watching for the duration of the meeting. Havix crossed over alone in a shuttle. She met him in the Solace's small conference room which had never been designed for diplomacy. A folding table, 4 bolted-down chairs, a wall display currently showing a navigation map. She did not apologize for its appearance because it was what they had and she had never been in the habit of apologizing for circumstance. She was already seated when he came through the door. She had not dressed for a meeting. She wore her plain working uniform showing no decorations because she had never seen the point of wearing them. Her coffee sat on the table. She had not offered him any and would not until she understood what he had come for. He was taller than she expected. Austrian tended to run broad through the chest and shoulders, and Havix carried the particular posture of someone who had spent a long career in military service. Straight without being rigid, the straightness of habit rather than effort. He looked at her with the kind of directness she respected even in someone she was not yet certain she trusted. He sat down across from her without waiting for an invitation which she also respected. "Admiral Voss," he said. "Commander Havix," she said. A moment of quiet passed between them and she let it sit. She was in no hurry. "I will tell you why I am here," he said, which she appreciated since she had expected far more preamble. "Please." "The war is moving in one direction," he said. "You know that, I know that. The supply chain engagement last week made certain things very clear." He set his hands on the table. "I believe there is still a point at which this can end without the total destruction of Austrian military capacity. I believe that point is close to passing." He looked at her steadily. "I am here to learn whether you are willing to discuss terms before it does." She looked at him. She had a quality in these moments of being entirely still, not tense, not cold, simply present, like someone who had stopped spending attention on anything but the thing directly in front of them. "Who sent you?" she said. "No one. Malric does not know you are here." "No. So you are not authorized to offer me anything." "A beat, I am authorized to listen," he said, "and to carry back what I hear." She nodded slowly. She lifted her coffee and drank and set it back down. "I have one question first," she said, "before we speak of terms." "Go ahead. Where is Overseer Malric?" Havix looked at her. He had prepared for a number of opening questions. He had not prepared for that one, and it told her something useful all on its own. "On Caldris Prime," he said, "at the Council of Ministers." "Not here, not directing the campaign." "He delegates operational command to me from Caldris Prime," she said, "while his fleet loses 41% of its advance force." Havix said nothing. I'm not asking to embarrass you, she said. I'm asking because it matters for what I am about to tell you. She set down her coffee. Terms, you want to know ours. I will tell you, and I will tell you plainly, because plain works better than clever when you need someone to actually hear you. She leaned forward slightly. The Austrian fleet withdraws from all human-claimed space. Every ship, every station, every piece of equipment within 90 days. She held up one finger. Second, all annexed territories, not only human ones, everything the Austrian have taken by force in the last 30 years are released. The populations there choose their own governance. Second finger raised. Third, full reparations to Meridian Hollow. Not a figure I name, a figure the survivors name. Whatever they decide. Third finger. Fourth, the overseer appears before an assembly tribunal on charges of crimes against a civilian population, the attack on the hospital ward. She stopped. Havex went very still. She looked at him. You knew about the hospital ward, it was not a question. He looked at the table. I was not present. I know you were not, I have the engagement records. I know exactly where you were. She let that sit a moment. I also know you did not force the mine shaft doors. I know 63 people are alive because of that. She paused. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that I know the difference between you and Malric. That difference is the entire reason you are sitting across from me right now instead of in a detention facility. Havex looked up. Carry those terms back to him, she said. Tell him they are final. Tell him. She paused, looked at her coffee, looked back up. Tell him the next phase of this campaign looks nothing like the last 8 months. Tell him we are finished being careful about what we hit. She said it quietly. That was the part that landed. He studied her face. She let him look. There was nothing to hide in it. She was not angry. She was not performing anything. She was simply a person telling another person the truth about a situation without decoration. He will not accept them, Havex said. I know. Then why offer them at all? Because I wanted it on record that the offer was made. She lifted her coffee again, and I wanted you to have heard them yourself directly from me. She paused for after. He understood exactly what she meant by after. She could see it settle onto his face. He was not a foolish man. He sat a moment longer, then he stood. He had arrived with questions. Indeed, she had answered every one of them more directly than he expected, and there was nothing left to sit for. The terms will be recorded on my ship's log, he said. Non-Austrian routing, in case he stopped. In case, she agreed. He nodded and moved toward the door. Commander Havex, she said. He turned. The hospital ward, she said. 22 children. I want you to carry that number with you. She said it without heat, not for me, for when you are deciding what comes next. He left. She sat alone in the conference room a while after his shuttle cleared the solace. She finished her coffee. She looked at the navigation map on the wall. She thought about the terms and about Malric and about what she had just told Havex. The next phase looks different. What that would mean and what it would cost and what it would leave behind. She did not enjoy what she was planning. She had never enjoyed any part of this. That was never the point. The point was finishing what had been started, which was not her fault, and doing it as cleanly as she was still able to, which was the only standard she still held herself to. She signaled the bridge and set a course back. Havex delivered the terms to Malric in person. He flew to Caldris Prime and went directly to the Council of Ministers building, all white stone and towering windows, the kind of architecture built specifically to make visitors feel small. He had been there many times. It had never actually made him feel small until now. Malric received him in his private office, a large room. The desk was very old, a gift from a species absorbed into Austrian territory 40 years earlier. Malric sat behind it in a chair slightly taller than the ones offered to visitors, which had always been deliberate and which Havex had never once thought about until this moment. He delivered the terms exactly as Voss had given them, clearly, plainly, in order. He added nothing. He softened nothing. He had considered on the flight back whether to frame them differently and had decided against it because Voss had been direct with him and he owed Malric the same regardless of what Malric chose to do with it. Malric listened. His face moved through several expressions: irritation, contempt, something that flickered briefly in his eyes when Havex said the word tribunal, and then contempt again. When Havex finished, Malric sat quiet a long moment. She wants me to stand trial, Malric said. Yes, before the assembly, before a tribunal. Yes. Malric looked at him. She called it crimes against a civilian population. Yes. for a military operation authorized by an assembly vote. Havoc said nothing. Malric stood and moved to the window. The view from his office showed the capital city, broad and white and built across centuries. Layer upon layer of Austrian civilization reaching back further than most species had even developed written language. He studied it a while. She is a savage, Malric said, not viciously, almost thoughtfully. 60 years into space, and she believes she can dictate terms to a civilization 900 years old. He turned from the window. His face had settled back into its familiar assurance. The face of a man who had never seriously entertained the possibility that he could be wrong about something this important. I want the Second Fleet activated, he said. Full mobilization, every available ship. We strike their forward command position and we strike the human homeworld directly. One blow, maximum force, and this ends. Havex looked at him. He had prepared for this answer too on the flight back. That will not work, he said. Malric looked at him. I am telling you it will not work, Havex said. His voice stayed steady. I have the engagement records, I have the loss projections. I have watched this campaign for 8 months and I am telling you directly that a full mobilization strike against the human homeworld will not end this war. It will deepen it. We cannot win a long war against these people. We are not built for what they are built for. They will absorb the loss and return harder and we will have nothing left to absorb it with. He stopped. Malric looked at him a long time. Activate the Second Fleet, he said. His voice had not changed, still calm, still decided. Still the voice of a man behind a desk built to make other men feel smaller. Havex looked at him. He had said what he came to say and he had said it clearly. There was nothing left to add after that. He left the office. He walked back through the white stone building and out into the open capital air and stood there a moment. Caldris Prime was a beautiful old world layered with history and architecture and meaning. He had been born here. He had walked these streets as a child. He thought about Voss's last words to him. He transmitted a message through the Corvin network once he reached his ship. 5 words. He refused, terms are rejected. Elder Alina Marsh stood before what remained of the assembly. Not every member was present, save. N delegations had withdrawn since the war began. 2 because they were Austrian allies. 5 because they had declared formal support for Earth and the Assembly's own rules barred active belligerents from floor access. The remaining members sat in their tiered seats inside the great black stone chamber, and the room felt emptier than it had 8 months earlier. Alina stood at the floor-level podium. She was 67 years old and wore ordinary clothes rather than anything formal because she had not had time to prepare anything and would not have known what to prepare regardless. She had been brought here aboard a fast diplomatic transport and had been told on the journey that her testimony would enter the formal assembly record permanently, which meant it would matter permanently. She stood at the podium and looked up at the tiers of alien faces and thought about Milo, the boy who had slept in her lap inside the mine shaft, currently staying with another family on the human homeworld while his own parents' case was processed, his parents having been among those who never made it out of the main settlement. She thought about what she wanted to say and how to say it. She spoke for 11 minutes without notes. She described Meridian Hollow as it had once been, the ore haulers, the orange light, the community hall where everyone gathered for decisions. The medical station where Dr. Renard worked and where on that Tuesday morning 22 children between the ages of 3 and 9 had been in the ward for ordinary childhood things, broken bones, respiratory infections, a minor surgery. She described what the ward looked like afterward. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She had already done all of that in the mine shaft and in the months afterward and in the small hours of the night in the quarters she had been given on the human homeworld. She had none of it left to spend here. She said what she had seen. She said it plainly. When she finished, the chamber sat in complete silence. Speaker Yelna, 22 years in the role, the permanent expression of a woman who had stopped being surprised by anything, spoke in a voice that was not entirely steady. The testimony of Elder Marsh is entered into the formal record. Alina nodded and stepped down from the podium. Ambassador Corvin watched from his seat in the middle tier and said nothing. He had not intended to speak. He watched her walk calmly across the chamber floor and exit through the side door, and he sat with the silence she left behind her. He thought about what Malric had once said, 900 years of civilization. He thought about what 11 minutes of plain words could do to a room that had spent centuries congratulating itself on that very civilization. Voss received Havex's message 30 minutes after Alina left the chamber. She read it. She finished her coffee. She gave one order. She did not enjoy what came next, but she did not stop it either. The second Austrian fleet numbered 11,000 ships. It had taken 3 weeks to mobilize, pulling vessels from patrol routes and colony defense positions and training yards where new crews were still being certified. Malric had ordered full mobilization, and full mobilization was exactly what he received. 11,000 ships assembled at the staging point near Caldrus Prime's outer ring, the largest single military force the Austrian had gathered in 200 years. It was an impressive thing to look at. Even Havex, who knew what was coming, stood on the bridge of the Dominion's edge and studied the formation on the tactical display and felt something move through him. Not quite pride, something older than pride. The recognition of scale, the way scale could still move you even when you already knew it would not be enough. Malric gave the order from his office on Caldrus Prime. He was not present in the field. He directed the campaign from the capital, which was his right as overseer. Havex had not argued the point. There was nothing left to argue. The fleet moved. Voss had been waiting for exactly this for 3 weeks. She had known it was coming since Havex's message had said terms rejected and not fleet standing down, and those were two very different things. She had used the 3 weeks well. She had not moved toward Caldrus Prime. She had done something that looked on any scan like a defensive posture, pulling her fleet back and consolidating around the approaches to human core space. It was not a defensive posture. It was a door. She had spent 3 weeks building that door, and when the Austrian Second Fleet passed through it, the door closed. The engagement that followed lasted 9 hours. It spanned a volume of space 2 light minutes across and involved roughly 12,000 vessels on both sides combined, since the 460 ships Voss had started with 3 weeks earlier had kept growing. Earth's shipyards had never stopped, and the allied species had kept sending support, and what had been 460 ships 3 weeks ago was now 612. Military historians studied the tactical records of that battle for decades afterward. Most of them focused on the same thing, not the scale, not the loss figures, the coordination. The human fleet and its allied vessels moved like a single organism, responsive and coherent across the entire engagement volume. Every time the Austrian formation shifted, the human response was already in motion, not reactive, anticipatory. Voss had run this battle 900 times in simulation across 3 weeks. She knew every response pattern in Austrian military doctrine because Havex had quietly sent her access to the doctrine files through the Corvine network the day after their meeting. She had not asked for them. He had sent them anyway. She used every one. At the 4-hour mark, the Austrian formation began to fragment. Not breaking apart yet, but losing coherence, the outer elements unable to coordinate with the center because the relay network was gone, and the backup communication systems were being actively jammed by 3 human specialist vessels that had done nothing else all day. At the 6-hour mark, the fragmentation became retreat. At the 9-hour mark, what remained of the second Austrian fleet was running for home. Voss sat in her chair on the bridge of the Meridian and watched the tactical display clear ship by ship as the Austrian vessels jumped to transit. Around her, the bridge crew exhaled, some quietly and some not, the sounds of people who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had just set it down. She let them have that moment. Then she sat with the display and studied her own losses. 94 ships, more than 4,000 people. She studied the numbers a long while and did not look away from them because she believed in facing costs directly without softening them and carrying them accurately. Then she gave the order to follow. The fall of Caldrus Prime was not a bombardment. Voss had been clear about this from the beginning, and she held to it even when 3 of her allied commanders pushed for exactly that, arguing that a bombardment would be faster and cleaner and would end the threat permanently. She listened to all 3 arguments and rejected every one for the same reason. Humans did not glass planets. It was not written down anywhere as a rule. It appeared in no military code or treaty. It was simply what she knew to be true about who she was and what she represented. There existed a line, and on one side of it she remained a commander finishing a war, and on the other side of it she became something she refused to be. She knew exactly where that line sat, and she stayed on her side of it. What came instead of bombardment was something the Austrian had no doctrine for at all because their doctrine assumed a species powerful enough to reach their homeworld would simply destroy it. They had no contingency for landing. The human fleet reached Caldrus Prime's outer defensive ring and dismantled it systematically over 6 hours. Every step was communicated as it happened, what was occurring, what would occur next, what the population on the surface could do to remain safe. Voss's communications teams broadcast continuously on every channel in Austrian, and in the three most common secondary languages used across their territory. Then the ships landed, not to burn, to hold. The Caldris Prime capital fell under human and allied occupation within 18 hours. There was resistance in pockets across 4 districts from military units that had chosen to stay rather than retreat, and the fighting during those hours ran close and costly, and Voss did not minimize it in her reports. But 18 hours after the first landing craft touched down, the capital was held. Malric was not in his office when they arrived. He was not at the Council of Ministers building. He was not at the military command center, which was the second place they searched. He was found on the third day inside a hardened shelter beneath his private residence, a facility built into bedrock specifically for this contingency and stocked with enough supplies for 6 months. He had been there since the Second Fleet broke. The soldier who found him was a 23-year-old human named Corporal Renner, who had joined the fleet 4 months after Meridian Hollow because someone needed to, and he was healthy and available and angry in the way young men get angry when something is done to their people. He had carried that anger through 9 months of war. He stood in the entrance of the shelter and looked at Malric, and his anger went somewhere he had not expected. Not away. Just quiet, like a fire that had burned a long time, and finally found the thing it had been burning toward, and did not know what to do next except be still. Malric looked back at him. He wore his formal robes, which he had apparently put on for this exact moment. His expression stayed composed, the look of a man who had made peace with something or was performing having made peace with it, and Renner could not tell which. "I surrender to Earth Command," Malric said formally in Austrian. Renner did not speak the language. He spoke into his comm instead. "I have him. Level 4 subsection 9. He is talking." He kept his weapon lowered and did not raise it. He stood in the entrance and waited for someone senior to arrive, and while he waited he looked at Malric, and Malric looked back at him, and neither of them said another word. Havex had taken the Dominion's edge out of formation before the battle ended, not fleeing. He had stayed through 6 of the 9 hours, but when the retreat became irreversible, he separated quietly and took his ship to the coordinates he had held in his navigation system since the day after his meeting with Voss. He was still at those coordinates when word arrived that Caldris Prime had fallen. He sat with that a long while. Then he transmitted his own surrender to Earth Command along with his location and his ship's identification, and a request that his crew be treated under the terms Voss had offered him in the Solace's conference room. He included the record he had kept since Meridian Hollow, all of it, the engagement logs, Malric's response to the terms, the fleet orders, the communications. Everything he had saved without knowing why he was saving it, and had kept saving anyway. The response from Earth Command arrived 2 hours later. It was brief. "Surrender accepted. Hold position. We are coming to you." The trial of Overseer Malric lasted 11 days. It was held on the assembly station in the great black stone chamber because there was nowhere else large enough and neutral enough, and because the assembly, now reduced to 31 active members with the Austrian seats sitting empty, had formally requested the venue, which was its way of saying it acknowledged what had happened and wanted to be seen acknowledging it. Voss did not testify in person. She submitted records instead: the engagement logs, the casualty figures, the broadcast from the Meridian Hollow Community Hall, the transcript of her meeting with Havex, the hospital ward documentation. She organized all of it carefully and submitted it without comment because the documents already spoke plainly enough on their own. Havex testified for 2 days. He was precise and detailed and softened nothing, including his own role in the occupation of Meridian Hollow. When the examining officer asked why he had contacted Voss without authorization, he said, "Because someone had to." When asked why he had saved the records, he said, "Because I believed there would be a day when they mattered." Corvin testified last. He had been asked to speak as a witness to the assembly session 8 months earlier. The vote, the debate, the warning. He sat in the witness chair inside the very chamber where he had given that speech and answered questions for 3 hours. At the end, the examining officer asked him whether anything in the aftermath had surprised him. Corvin considered the question seriously, the way he considered every question. "No," he said. "I expected it to take longer, but the shape of it was exactly what I described in my warning, which means the information had always been available." He looked at the floor a moment. "What surprised me, if anything, is how little it would have taken to avoid all of this. Not much. Just the ability to hear something you do not want to hear." He paused. "That is a small thing to ask. Most people find it very difficult." Malric was convicted on 11 counts. He was not executed. There was significant debate over this. 3 allied species pressed for it, and Voss received formal inquiries from 4 governments asking Earth Command's position. Earth Command's position was trial and imprisonment, not execution. A journalist given access to record the war asked her privately why, given everything, she had argued against the harsher sentence. Voss thought about the question. Because he needs to remain alive to watch what happens next, she said. She did not elaborate further. She did not need to. What happened next was 12 years of rebuilding. Meridian Hollow. The other colony struck in month 3. The territories the Austrian had annexed over 30 years, whose people were now sorting out what self-governance looked like after decades under someone else's administration. It was complicated and slow and full of arguments and setbacks, and the kind of grinding daily work that never resembles victory, but is the only form victory actually takes in the long run. Earth contributed to all of it: ships, materials, technical staff, medical teams. Voss signed 53 bilateral agreements across the 2 years after the war ended. She drank a great deal of terrible coffee at a great many negotiating tables and did not enjoy most of it, which was fine since she had never read enjoyment from her work, only results. Maurik watched from his cell, which was comfortable and well maintained because she had specified that too. She was never interested in cruelty. She was interested in the thing she had told Havix about inside the Solace's conference room, the thing she had called after. It was taking shape slowly and messily, the way all real things do. Ambassador Corvin visited the human homeworld a second time 2 years after the war ended. He had not planned to. He had retired from the Thren diplomatic service 6 months after the trial, quietly and without ceremony, because he was old and tired, and had spent enough of his long life in chambers with high ceilings trying to say true things to rooms that were not listening. He had gone home to the Thren homeworld and spent a season doing very little, which felt unfamiliar and which he found, to his own surprise, that he did not mind at all. Then he booked passage to Earth. He told no one. He went alone. The city he arrived in was called Nairobi. He had not visited it on his first trip, which had taken him to Geneva for the diplomatic meetings and Johannesburg for the museum. Nairobi felt different. Large and fast and layered, old buildings standing beside new ones, markets beside transit stations, trees growing up through infrastructure built around them rather than cleared away. He walked most of the first day with no plan at all. He looked at things. He ate food from a stall near a transit station, something with rice and a sauce he could not identify that was considerably hotter than he expected, and he finished it anyway. Later he sat on a bench in a park where children were playing a game involving a ball and rules he could not follow and a tremendous amount of noise. He was sitting there watching the game when a child came and stood in front of him. She looked to be about 8 years old and carried the direct, unguarded curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to perform social uncertainty. She studied him, his gray hair coloring, his age, the particular way his eyes sat with open interest. "What are you?" she said. "A traveler," he said. "Where did you come from?" "Far away." She considered this. "Is it nice there?" He looked at her. Behind her the game continued, shouting and running and arguments over rules and laughter. Around the park the city moved, ordinary and loud, full of the texture of people living close together, which always carried both friction and noise and occasionally beauty. He thought about the Unity Assembly Chamber. He thought about Maurik's smile. He thought about the vote and the window and the cold blue-white light of the corridor. He thought about Elena Marsh and 11 minutes of plain words in a silent room. He thought about Meridian Hollow, the orange light, the ore haulers. 40,000 people who had looked at 1,100 ships and answered with a hunting rifle and an ore cannon, and a fully loaded freighter driven at top speed by someone who jumped clear at the very last second. He thought about what it meant to be built from 10,000 years of surviving yourself, and what that made you capable of, and what it cost you along the way. He looked at the child. It was, he said, before we made the mistake of believing we were the most dangerous thing in the sky. The child considered this with the seriousness children reserve for things that do not quite make sense to them, but that they recognize as meaning something anyway. "Are you staying?" she said. He looked around the park. The game, the trees, the city beyond, building on top of history, on top of grief, on top of whatever came next and the thing after that. "For a while," he said. She seemed satisfied by this. She turned and ran back toward the game, which had generated a fresh dispute requiring her immediate attention. Corvin sat on the bench in the afternoon light, a different color than the light back on the Thren homeworld, sharper and more gold than orange, and watched the children play until the light began to change. Then he stood and walked back into the city and disappeared into its noise. One more traveler from far away, moving through a world that had learned something the way every world learns things, too late, at tremendous cost, and forward anyway into whatever came next. If this story landed for you the way it landed for Alina Marsh, sitting in the dark with a sleeping child on her lap the way it landed for Havoc staring at a star map full of dying lights, then you already know what to do next. Hit that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need a story like this one. And if you have not already subscribed, do it now, so you never miss the next chapter of humanity refusing to go quietly. There are more stories like Meridian Hollow waiting for you right here on this channel. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and I will see you in the next one.